Hi, I'm Aurel Enriquez, and this video contains our special topic in microbiology, where we talk about things that we don't usually discuss in our regular classes. In line with the Rabies Awareness Month this March, let's look into the National Rabies Prevention and Control Program here in the Philippines. Here is the outline of our discussion. Let's first have a quick review on rabies infections, like how is it transmitted, how does it get to the brain, what are its clinical manifestations, and then next let's learn about the two types of post-exposure prophylaxis. Then let's look at the recent stats of rabies infections here in the Philippines, and finally let's find out what government programs do we have against rabies. Let's go right ahead with our quick refresher on what is rabies. Rabies virus belongs to the family Rhabdoviridae under the genus Lyssavirus. As shown on the photos at the bottom right, they are rod-shaped or bullet-shaped. They're also enveloped with glycoprotein spikes, and they're also single-stranded RNA viruses. Rabies is a zoonotic disease, which means that it can be transmitted between species, specifically among the mammalian species. Rabies is mainly transmitted through the saliva of an infected animal. So, when an infected dog, for example, bites a human, the virus enters the human host through the bite wound. Or an open wound is already present and the human would come in contact with the infectious saliva. Here in the Philippines, dogs are the primary carriers of rabies in the country. So, of the animal rabies cases reported in 2018, we'll talk more about this data later. 85.7% of the cases were because of dogs, and then 12.5% were cats, and there's a small percentage that represents other domestic animals. Rabies in domestic animals would include cattle, carabaos, pigs, goats, and horses. So these have been reported since the 1930s, but all of these were traced to the bite of rabid dogs. There have also been a few rare cases of transmission through infected organ donors. You can check out this article right here. And of course, there's also occupational exposure. Now, what do you think would be the types of jobs that would place you at high risk for contracting rabies? Examples would be canine dog handlers, pet groomers, and of course, people who work in rabies diagnostic and research laboratories. Let's look into the pathogenesis of rabies infections. When the rabies virus gets inoculated into the skin or muscle, they begin to replicate, but not that much. All right, so these virus particles would replicate just until they reach the nearest neuromuscular junction. From there, it will travel straight to the brain and proceed to replicate again. But now, this time they are here at their preferred host cells, which would be the patient's neurons. Okay, so their receptor for the host cell or entry to the host cells would be the acetylcholine receptor. Incubation period has a wide range of variation from 1 week up to a year. So generally, this depends on the distance between the point of entry to the brain. If a bite wound was on the leg, for example, that might take a longer incubation period. Comparing that to a person that, for example, was attacked on the face. So, since the point of entry of the virus particles are closer to the brain, that could lead to a shorter incubation period. The clinical manifestations of rabies are divided into three phases. The first is the prodromal phase, where a lot of symptoms of rabies are nonspecific and they may even resemble the flu, with fever, sore throat, headache, even gastrointestinal symptoms like nausea and vomiting. There are also symptoms that would include abnormal sensation around the wound site and increased sensitivity to light, termed as photophobia. Next is the anger stage, where the patient is now displaying signs of abnormally aggressive behavior even without being triggered by anything. Finally, the patient reaches the acute neurologic phase. Now that the virus has successfully replicated in the brain, it can now spread outwards again along the nerves of some of our organs. So that would include the eyes, particularly the cornea, the hair follicles, but most importantly, the virus particles would now spread out to the salivary gland. Now, these are the same clinical manifestations of rabies in infected animals, which is why dogs, for example, can infect us by biting us because the virus has come back out of the brain to the salivary glands. So, these three clinical manifestations highlighted here are particularly helpful in successfully transmitting the virus from a rabid animal onto a new host. So let's look into these ones. Hypersalivation ensures that there is enough rabies infected saliva in the optimal transmission location, which is the mouth. Hydrophobia plus difficulty swallowing makes sure that the saliva carrying the virus particles doesn't get washed away. In animals, the aggression could result to attacking another animal. So hypersalivation plus hydrophobia plus difficulty swallowing plus the tendency to bite another animal equals a highly effective way to pass the virus. But of course, for us humans, we are not driven by aggression in the same way as infected animals are. So there aren't any person to person transmission of rabies except from the infected organ donors, as mentioned earlier. Currently, there are no WHO approved diagnostic tools for detecting rabies infection before the onset of clinical disease. Clinical diagnosis of rabies is difficult without an accurate history of contact with a rabid animal or the very specific symptoms of hydrophobia. So, the steps that I'll briefly be discussing here are done as post mortem confirmation, specifically after the suspected animal has been captured. So, after euthanizing the rabid animal, the brain is obtained to create impression smears, specifically from their cerebellum, hippocampus, medulla oblongata, and pons. After that, they proceed with the microscopy methods shown here, such as immunofluorescence or the observation of Negri bodies. So, if you're interested on the specifics of these procedures, check out the references at the end of this video. This is also something that we don't usually talk about during our regular classes. So, let's have an easy discussion on post exposure prophylaxis or PEP. People who have been exposed to the virus can get a series of shots that can help the immune system fight off the virus. But this has to be done before the symptoms start to show. Otherwise, once the symptoms begin to be observed, specifically when we get to the symptoms listed under acute neurologic phase, rabies, as discussed earlier, is 100% fatal. So first is category 1. Category 1 are for people who has had no exposure to the virus and therefore would have no need to receive any post-exposure intervention. For category 2, ideally, even for just minor cuts or scratches, even without visual bleeding, immediate vaccination is recommended. On to category 3, transdermal bites or scratches, broken skin, contamination of mucous membranes. Category 3 requires immediate vaccination and the administration of rabies immunoglobulins. The rationale behind giving immunoglobulins for these cases is that we can no longer wait for the immune system to form its own antibodies. So that's going to take a while. We need to be able to fight off the virus before it reaches the brain. Story time. I personally have experienced being a category 3 patient. So, trigger warning for those who are sensitive to seeing injuries or other stuff like that. I will be showing actual photos of my arm after the animal attack. This is after I've already cleaned the lacerations. So, this happened in 2022. So, I just moved into my new dorm. You see, I absolutely love cats. Right? I also love dogs. I probably love all animals, but anyway, I love cats. Everyone in my family loves cats. I grew up with cats. All right, so I am the type of person to be late to a meeting just because I saw a cat on the street and I stopped to pet the cat. Do you get me? Are there people watching this that are also like that? Anyway, so I saw this cat at my new dorm. Okay, so he was so big. He was a fully grown adult male stray cat. Okay, so I walked over to the cat to pet it, and I was scratching his chin and everything, and he seemed a bit annoyed. He seemed a bit annoyed, and he was flicking his tail. So I stopped and I went away. Right. So a few days after that, I bought some cat food just because I wanted to feed him if I ever see him again, and I did. So a few days later, I saw the cat again. So I walked up to the cat and gave it some food. When he finished the food, he laid down. So I pet him again. So we were both chill. He wasn't flicking his tail as much as the first time. But I was so shocked when he suddenly bit my hand and, okay, he proceeded to kick my arm while the half of my hand was still in his mouth. Okay. So this was my arm after I've already washed it with soap and water and have already applied iodine. Now, these two areas right here, this one and this one, so here is where his teeth punctured me. So he had big teeth. I literally had a hole in my palm as big as the tip of a sharpened pencil. All right, so these were the scratches by its hind legs as it was kicking my arm. So this is what the hole in my palm looked like as it was healing. And this is the cat. All right. So look at how big his teeth were. All right. So this is my hand. That's my hand petting him again, even after the attack. So I continued to pet the cat with the same hand where he previously attacked me because I never learned my lesson. Anyway, there are two types of post-exposure vaccines based on how they are manufactured. So first is the H-Rig or the human rabies immune globulin. So this is composed of gamma globulins produced by hyper-immunized humans. Meanwhile, the ARIG or the equine rabies immune globulin is made from concentrated serum of horses that were hyperimmunized with the rabies virus. The problem with ARIG is that some people are actually allergic to this formula since the antibodies were sourced from a different species. The antibodies were produced by horses, which is why before administering a full dose of this type of vaccine, usually a skin test is performed. So if the skin test gives a negative reaction, ARIG is given to the patient. And this type of vaccine is less expensive and easier to find. But if the skin test shows a positive allergic reaction to a rig, then each rig will be administered to the patient. The downside to this is that even just one vial is very expensive and difficult to find in most pharmacies. Let's now look into the burden of rabies cases in the Philippines. This data was brought to us by the Department of Health together with the Department of Agriculture under the Bureau of Animal Industry for the National Rabies Prevention and Control Program Strategic Plan for 2020 to 2025. Rabies remains to be the most acutely fatal infectious disease, claiming the lives of around 250 to 300 Filipinos every year. So the high cost of anti-rabies vaccine and immunoglobulin, plus the expenditure for medical consultations and the loss of income are an additional burden to a regular Filipino family confronted with a potential rabies exposure. So as shown here, the number of human rabies cases in the past 12 years has been fluctuating from 2007 to 2018. So for 2018, there were a total of 276 human rabies cases over the estimated population of 107,587,132 Filipinos, with an average of 2.57 rabies incidents per million of the population. This means that a little more than two people per million of the population die because of rabies. Now, to reduce the incidence of rabies, animal bite treatment centers, or ABTCs, where patients are able to access human anti-rabies vaccines and immune globulin for PEP, have been established in strategic areas all over the Philippines. In 2018, there were 1,156,377 animal attacks, and 99% of those exposures were mostly through bites. Now, 9.3% were of Category 1 exposures, which do not require PEP, while 74.68% were Category 2, and 26.72 were Category 3 exposures. In summary, most of the exposures are classified as Category 2. The number of animal bite treatment centers, or ABTCs, where people who have been potentially exposed to rabies are able to access human anti-rabies vaccine and immunoglobulin for PEP, increased in number from only 256 nationwide in 2007 to 613 centers to 2018. So it could be observed based on the data here that there is a corresponding increase in reported rabies exposures if the number of ABTCs is also increasing, which makes sense. So since animal bite treatment centers have become more accessible, subsequently, people are now more willing to seek medical assistance in case of potential rabies exposure. And of course, these animal bite treatment centers would also be able to collect more accurate data to create reports like these. So, again, because of the increase of animal bite treatment centers in the country, animal bite cases were properly recorded and reported. Let's now talk about components of the National Rabies Prevention and Control Program. Again, this is a program of the Department of Health and Department of Agriculture under the Bureau of Animal Industry. All the data that we've been discussing in the previous segment also came from this published strategic plan. Just a super quick history: in the late 1980s, the Department of Agriculture, through the Bureau of Animal Industry, and the Department of Health, through the then Communicable Disease Control Service, initiated efforts to prevent and control rabies in the country. So, fast forward to 2007, the Republic Act 9482, also known as the Anti Rabies Act of 2007, was signed into law by the former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, mandating that there shall be the National Rabies Prevention and Control Program to be implemented by a multi agency or multi sectoral committee called the National Rabies Prevention and Control Committee, which is chaired by the Bureau of Animal Industry from the Department of Agriculture. Now, what are the vision and goal of the National Rabies Prevention and Control Program? Their vision was to be in a rabies-free Philippines by 2030. Their goal was to end human deaths from dog-mediated rabies by 2027. Now, let me repeat what I said earlier on slide 5. Here in the Philippines, although dogs are the primary carriers of rabies in the country, based from the data reported in 2018, 85.7% of the cases were dogs, but there's the 12.5% of exposure due to cats, and even a small percentage that is from other domestic animals. So, most likely, on their updated strategic plan, they might need to revise this goal since we've already established that rabies in the Philippines is not exclusively acquired from dog populations. Let's now proceed to some of the program components. We will not be discussing all of them, so again, if you want to learn more about these program components, simply look into the references by the end of this video. One of the strategic objectives of this program is to increase PEP completion rate among registered rabies exposed cases to 90% by the end of 2025. So this would have to factor in the procurement of rabies vaccine and immunoglobulin. This should also include um, them being able to ensure timely delivery to the animal bite treatment centers, and of course, health promotion activities to remind and encourage the people to complete all of their doses of PEP. So, just in case you didn't know, post exposure rabies vaccination comes in multiple doses at different intervals, which is why completion rates among the exposed are very important. Another strategic objective within this program is to increase rabies immunoglobulin coverage to 80% by the end of 2025. So, the previously collected data on the coverage of rabies immunoglobulin is low, only at 40%. And this is because of the high price and inadequate supply, right? High price, inadequate supply of rabies immunoglobulin at the animal bite treatment centers. So this would now point to the proper allocation of funds. Okay? So the DOH shall allocate funds to or for the procurement of rabies immunoglobulin, and advocacy will be done to local chief executives for fund allocation for RIG in their respective LGUs. Okay? So the next strategic objective is to reduce out-of-pocket expenditures for PEP of 75% of the bite victims by the end of 2025. So the program has negotiated with the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation or PhilHealth to include a benefit package for rabies exposure cases for human rabies post-exposure prophylaxis to ensure a full course of rabies immunization with vaccine and rabies immunoglobulin. So this would definitely contribute to the success of the previous objective, which is to increase PEP completion rate. If people no longer have to worry about the expenses of vaccination and treatment, then this is most likely, or this is um, one of the things that would encourage them to comply with finishing all of their doses. Let's now talk about the health promotion activities that serves as an education campaign for the rabies prevention and control program. So, under the Executive Order number 84, the celebration of Rabies Awareness Month in the Philippines will be every March. Aside from that, we also have September 28th, which was declared by the WHO as World Rabies Day. There's also efforts to distribute information, education, and communication materials, the utilization of multiple forms of media, and the integration of rabies program into the curriculum of elementary school children. So that would be those within grades 1 to 6. So this would serve as a collaborative effort between the Department of Health and the Department of Education to educate school children who are most vulnerable to animal bites. Now, if we think about it in some way, on my part as an educator, as a college professor, making videos like these is also considered as a form of health promotion and education to raise awareness. Next component of the program is our central database. Now, the Philippine Animal Health Information System was established to provide a data on dog registration, vaccination, and reports of canine rabies. We also have the National Rabies Information System, or NARIS, which is an internet based information system that allows for reporting health facilities to automate bite patient records and generate report that at the same time could also provide accurate and real-time data to program managers at the national, regional, and provincial levels, leading to more effective and efficient delivery of health services on the local and national scale. So the NARIS is expected to help us with the following. Number one is to ensure the availability of timely and accurate data on rabies and rabies exposures. Number two is to improve access to health information on rabies and its preventions, and also to effectively disseminate information on where post exposure prophylaxis or PEP and rabies diagnostic services are available. Number four is to make available information on the status of program logistics for program managers or coordinators. And the last one is to effectively disseminate information on the reports of the government to control and eliminate rabies in the Philippines. Other program components include the strategy of promoting responsible pet ownership to prevent the spread of rabies. So the public is advised to bring their pet dogs for anti-rabies vaccination when they reach 3 months of age and then yearly thereafter. And to, of course, the usual provide proper nutrition, exercise, and shelter to their pet dogs, and to not allow their pet dogs to roam around and prevent contact with potentially infected animals. Next, the Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Animal Industry, takes the lead in mass dog vaccination campaigns and provision of animal rabies vaccine. Next is dog population management. So this would include stray dog management through impounding, field control, disposal, surgical and non-surgical sterilization, and of course habitat control. And also on page 59 of the strategic plan that was published, Upland Red was also discussed, which stands for the operational plan for rabies elimination in dogs in the Philippines. If you want to read more about the National Rabies Control and Prevention Program or learn more about all the other things that we've discussed in the previous segments, here are the references used in the making of this video. That ends our discussion on rabies prevention and control in the Philippines. This has been Aurel Enriquez. Thank you so much for watching.